Okay, can you all hear me okay? Yes. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm coming to you from central Minnesota, United States, where I work in a Roman Catholic seminary context for both lay and ordained formation and in the Benedictine spiritual tradition. And I'm here to talk today about theological reflection. And I'm just giving a verbal summary of my paper, but you can take a look at it if you haven't already on the website. So my concern for this presentation was how to bring this concept of theological reflection into conversation with digital culture. And in particular, the linear components of theological reflection and its methods, going from step to step to step. How does that work in a networked context such as that we experience in a digital culture? And how can we think about it pedagogically and practically for ministry formation? So let me just break that open a little bit, and then I'm looking forward to the respondent very much, as well as additional comments. So first of all, what do I mean by theological reflection? We often use this term very broadly to describe our hope for our students to think theologically, whatever that means, to be able to bring theology into the conversation, whatever they're thinking about. But when I'm using this term in this paper, in this project, I'm speaking about a more particular genre of pedagogical models and methods that are integral to ministerial formation. So in other words, when we use theological reflection as a concept in ministry formation, it is a pedagogical method to help those training for ministry think intentionally about bringing content of the tradition and experience together into a fruitful conversation toward pastoral action, toward being able to make good pastoral decisions in a given situation. So when I talk about theological reflection, I mean that. And it is in that context, in that formation context, a work of integration, a work of capturing multiple layers of a situation in a context, and above all, for me, creating a space for that conversation to take place in which these elements of content and experience and culture and context can come to some kind of convergence, dialogue with each other, produce tension, challenge each other, but also come to some kind of convergence so that there could emerge some sort of new step moving forward. And whether that's a pastoral plan or whether that's a new insight, there's a range between those two, but some sort of outcome emerges from it for pastoral action. So this is broadly what I'm talking about. And in my professional opinion, as well as my scholarly work on this, there are especially three elements. Certainly there are more, but I'm going to name three that help form good theological reflection for this work. And in my paper, I highlighted listening, I highlighted truth, commitment to truth, and creativity as three of these essential elements. I know they also sound very Benedictine, but that's my context. And so it's also coming out of that spirituality. But so listening, for example, the first one, for me is the starting point for good theological reflection and offers that space for hospitality for these elements of the experience to come together and to come to convergence. And if we don't listen well, that doesn't happen. So I unpacked it in the paper somewhat. Commitment to truth and honesty is another element. Others think that that's the starting point. The Whiteheads, for example, start with that commitment to truth. And yes, rightfully, when we talk about bringing our stories together in a space of convergence, it must be truthful, it must be honest, both from our perspective, but also honoring the truth of other stories and other experiences that we encounter. And then creativity. Creativity especially speaks to the aspect of theological reflection where we're looking at that new outcome at the end, that novel piece, that new insight, that new decision moving forward. I also see this creativity piece as very much a transcendent piece open to the guidance of the Spirit to create something new out of this situation. Okay, so just in a nutshell. So questions that emerge about theological reflection for me when I think about digital culture have to especially to do with method. So just to break it down a little bit, theological reflection, we talk about models and methods. When we use the term models of theological reflection, we're talking about its constitutive elements that come together: experience, content, culture. That would be the models of it. How they come together and what fashion do we bring them into conversation are methods. So methods of theological reflection create kind of these step-by-step processes of let's first look at experience, or let's first look at content, or let's first look at foundations. Let's then look at this step, 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 until we arrive at making a decision. So those will be methods of theological reflection. And here's where my questions come in. Methods could be multi-steps. Some methods are 3, some methods are 4, some methods are 5 steps, depending on the scholar you're looking at. By and large, though, when we're looking at these methods, in and of themselves, they produce a linear experience. So step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. So also, when we are working with this in a classroom setting or a formation setting, we're helping students move through step 1, step 2, step 3. Or if you ask them to do a written theological reflection, that's the step structure of their paper. So very linear in that sense. And a footnote, and this is more acknowledged in my paper, scholars of theological reflection will acknowledge, though, that it's not a linear process ultimately, but a cyclical one. We should always be returning to the experience and examining it over again. But my point is that in practice, it tends to be a linear experience in classroom use. So we can unpack that if you wish. But that's a question that emerges for me in digital context, especially because we're finding ourselves in a context that is, of course, as you know, hypertextual, multiple layers of convergence coming together, the network and the model of the network in terms of these nodes of connectivity that are very social. How does a linear method work through something like that? So that's one genuine question I have. Can linearity have a place within that, or do we need to think completely apart from that into something that's more genuinely network-based as a thought process? And so one question I have is, what would a networked model of theological reflection look like, honoring this networked concept of the culture that we're living in? And what would that bring to the table beyond step 1, step 2, step 3, and so forth? Or is that still necessary because that's how our minds are constructed at this point still? So that's genuinely a question for me that I'm still thinking through. I'm grateful for responses along those lines, either today or if you want to communicate with me. But I did begin playing with this idea of encounter and having that be a generative concept for a method for digital culture. And this is kind of akin to neighborhood, like Andrew talked about and Kelvin talked about. But what would a method look like in terms of encounter? What would a method of encounter look like for theological reflection? And I like that. I begin to think about that. I like that because of that idea of sort of a diffuse network, but with these nodes of connectivity that are very much social when convergences happen. So I think that's something that's further to develop. I will say from the Roman Catholic theological context, encounter is a very generative concept as well for social communication and for thinking about digital culture. So I'd like to think more about that myself, but I'm very much open to your thoughts on that or broader thoughts in general. So I'm gonna conclude here and give my time forward to the respondent if you want to.
Thank you, Daniella. Sean.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Cool. All right, well, I am enormously grateful for the opportunity to respond to this paper. Thank you, Kate, for moderating, and to Jonas and Kyle for putting on this great conference. This conference is actually exciting, happening at an exciting time in my life as I'm working on creating and implementing education and ordination processes for my denomination. So I'll be going through those while I'm creating them, which is an interesting thing for an MDiv student, I recognize. I'm looking forward to engaging others on this topic of ministerial formation. Daniella, it was a great pleasure to read and engage your paper. You offer an exciting contribution to the study of digitality and ministerial formation, especially as it relates to the prismatic nature of our network lives in this force field that is our digital context. In what follows, I will highlight 3 themes in the paper that I detect: conversion, hospitality, and the institutional context of ministerial formation, very admittedly in the United States. I'll offer that up front. And I'm going to offer some cursory reflections along the way. First, you call us towards a method of networked theological reflection that encompasses a both-and approach, which means bringing together the form and content of theology into dialogue with concrete pastoral action. This means that on the one hand, as you point out, theological reflection is largely linear. It moves along steps in a clear fashion. It should also be, however, cyclical and spiral. It should reflect and refract a myriad of life circumstances, personal experiences, and theological positions to create, and I'm quoting here, a space for listening to and honoring the truth of the many points of view that converge in a given ministerial situation so as to discern and move toward a new life-giving possibility for all, unquote. This new and life-giving possibility is to be, quote, a dynamic process ever disposed to conversion and ultimately open to the grace and movement of the Spirit, unquote. I find the use of the term conversion here is interesting, to say the least, as I at least imagine conversion to be a radical break from something that came before, so something in a very linear process. And I would like to hear some more thoughts from you on this term, especially considering your resistance or questioning of the linear method. Regarding hospitality, this networked method is to be multi-directional and dynamic, largely focused on hospitable encounter where conversion can actually occur. Indeed, and I quote, the point of analyzing a complex ministerial situation with hospitality and honesty is to determine a way forward from it. As I take it, you think of hospitality as that practice of creating space through active listening and truth-telling that should lead towards novel and fecund pastoral action. In a very important sense, it seems that pastoral action itself is to be conversionary if it is to be truly novel. Another question I have here, and this is for every node in this network of theological reflection, how are we to be hospitable and open to conversion without being overtaken, colonized, or forced to withdraw from the other nodes of the network, or vice versa? And this leads to my third and final point of institutional context, again, very much the United States. There seems to be a strong cautioning against the so-called Berlin model, using the model from David Kelsey's fine book. The Berlin model, with its twin emphases on critical research and preparation for professional ministry, as the Berlin model is too often awash in concepts sealed off from real life. Instead, I think I'm detecting an inclination towards the Athens model, with its emphasis on the telos of culturing and character formation. I sense this especially when you rightfully ask, how might we adhere to truth and forge bonds towards community and communion when the online environment increasingly disposes us to conflict? I think this is especially salient when considering the networked theological reflection method envisioned in your paper. How, though, might this conversion happen when we, one, live within technologies that feed our doom scrolling and commodify us, as you point out in the paper, as we, too, have a widely acknowledged lacuna of spiritual formation in at least Protestant seminaries? I'm very happy that you're teaching at a Catholic seminary because I think we can learn a lot as Protestants from you. And three, we are increasingly aware of the historical racial components of professional theological education, at least in the United States. Underlying all these concerns is that this networked age brings along increasing institutional ambivalence as individuals seek authenticity. And really, I think that means the meaning of life. What might it mean to be converted and hospitable when nearly the entire landscape that is the seminary div school model is being actively transformed? And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you, everyone, for your time and your attention.